balancing games is really difficult. You'll spend months trying to balance the game perfectly, doing little tweaks here and there, saying, oh, I'm going to add a little power here, subtract a little power there. And then, you give it to your players and they immediately play it in the first 10 minutes, 10,000 times as many hours as you played it the entire time you were testing it. They find all sorts of problems you didn't know were there, and they completely break your game. And I think Magic has really seen that a lot in the past few years as, the number of people playing it has really gone up. The amount of time people spend playing it has really gone up thanks to things like Arena. So it's just become way and way easier to break Magic. But most games have an escape valve in this sense. I mean, think of a game like Hearthstone. What happens when they print a card that does better than they expected in Hearthstone? Well, they just nerf it into the ground. They're able to actually change the text of the card because it's a digital game. The same thing happens with, pretty much every video game these days. You have a first-person shooter, the shotgun's too strong. What do? They nerf the shotgun, right? So every game these days can basically be released in a imperfect state and corrected via patches, via nerfs, via power-ups. It's easy to fix balance issues these days, except if you're Magic the Gathering, because Magic the Gathering is in a pretty unique position where despite Arena being big, despite there being a lot of digital Magic play, it's really a paper game when it comes down to it. That's where the money is, right? And that's what Wizards really cares about. It's a game about printing little pieces of paper, putting them in card sleeves, and then playing them against each other. So at the end of the day, when they want to fix something, if they say, oh man, we made that Planeswalker too strong, they can't just go in and change it, right? If they wanted to do that, if they wanted to go in and say, okay, we're going to make this thing cost 2 mana more, then they have to think about, well, how are we going to actually get that to the players? We have to reprint this card in some way with the new text, and even when we do that, there's still going to be, from the first printing, there's going to be all these copies floating around with the wrong text on it, so we have to have some way to make it easy for them to know that the text isn't right, and this new version, we have to print enough of it so it's not rarer than the old version, because then it becomes a problem of nobody has the right version. And so there's a lot of logistical issues that come into play when you're trying to errata something that's paper, that's a physical product. That has meant that Magic basically doesn't do it. Magic essentially does not errata cards, they just ban them. And that's sort of their best resource. And the problem with that is that banning has its own costs. Maybe you don't have to figure out a way to reprint the card and get the text right and yada yada yada. But you make people quit the game, right? It defeats the entire purpose of a collectible game like Magic the Gathering. So all that to say, Magic would really like to be able to nerf its cards. It would love to be able to be like Hearthstone, where they can just correct problems and they don't have to have this, nuclear meltdown every time they mess up development. And so on Magic Arena, they're doing a errata event, essentially. They're doing an event where they take some of the more problematic designs for the past few years and changing them up, changing them in ways that make them more fair, make them more fun, maybe. And they're kind of dipping their toe in a big way into a zone where they've never really gone before. So Wizards has said that this is just kind of for fun. This is just, we're just kind of a errata-ing card, just for fun, just to see how things go. Maybe people like it, but I think, realistically, this is a fact-finding mission. I think, despite their saying this is all just fun and games, I do think this is probably a test to see how players react to errata cards, and I don't think it's just for fun. But anyway, I thought it would be fun for us to take a look at all the cards that they're modifying and talk about what it means for these cards. Talk about, does it, make them more fair? Does it make them so fair that they're basically unplayable? Did they hit that sweet spot, or maybe they didn't nerf them enough and they'll still be busted? So let's take a look at the cards and I'll tell you what I think. Hey, I'm down here now. Okay, so the first card is Agent of Treachery. So we're looking at the original version of the card right now. So Agent of Treachery is a 7-mana 2/3, so not a card you would expect to be busted, but when it enters the battlefield, you gain control of target permanent. And then at the end of your end step, if you control 3 more permanents that you don't own, draw 3 cards. So the second part is really, sometimes it matters, but not really. The real issue is when it enters the battlefield, you gain control of target permanent. And this was seen, basically it was just the best thing to cheat into play in a format full of ways to cheat things into play, which might have actually been the issue. But out of all those, Agent of Treachery just kind of proved itself to be the best thing to do compared to anything else. So if you had a way to cheat this into play, if you had a way to blink this, you know, so it could get its enter the battlefield ability multiple times, it was just by and far the best thing to do in the format. So essentially that's what it came down to. They banned it because there were just kind of too many ways to cheat it out into play, and rather than ban everything that can cheat it out into play, they just banned the card itself. So let's see what they did to fix it. And so this is the new version of the card. This is the one that will be in the Arena errata event. So 7 mana, 2/3. When it enters the battlefield, if you cast it from your hand, gain control of target permanents, and the rest of it's the same. So it's almost the same card with one extra little clause that to get its gain control of target permanent ability, you have to have casted it from your hand. Not even just played it from your hand, not even that it came from your hand, not even that you casted it, you know, so if you cast it from the graveyard in some way, it still doesn't, it has to be specifically that you cast it from your hand. And so that really just gets rid of, you know, most of the ways you could cheat this out, right? There's still some ways you could do it, but it kind of, at least in the standard sense and probably historic too, it puts this into a position where you have to pretty much ramp it out. You have to pretty much get up to 7 mana and actually cast this thing to make it good. And so this does basically kill all the different ways that Agent of Treachery was good in its original incarnation, because it was just a card you cheated out, right? It's sort of like Emrakul in that sense, sort of you know, not nearly as good as Emrakul, but a standard Emrakul, in the sense that you don't ever really cast Emrakul. You know, there's some rare occasions where you might, but the idea is that you cheat out an Emrakul and it's enough to win you the game. Agent of Treachery was in that same boat, and it's basically can't do that anymore. So this has been relegated to sort of the top end of a ramp deck, and it might actually still be good enough to see some play in some deck like that. Maybe some sort of blue-green X ramp deck with Nissa, the mana doubling Nissa is still a way you could basically cheat this out. And there's still, you know, I think in a ramp shell, it is still probably one of the best, you know, finishers, but not being able to blink it or reuse its effect, or, you know, it is very limited in the sense that it's kind of a one-shot now, and you have to actually ramp to it. So I think there's a chance it may just see no play with just this little extra clause. As small as it might seem, it might just be enough to make this see no play. But I also wouldn't be surprised to see it as like a top end in some sort of ramp shell. I think in a control shell or something like that, you wouldn't see it. It would just be like planeswalkers and stuff that were, you know, 4 or 5 mana. There's no real reason to put all their eggs in the basket with Agent of Treachery. So I think in a ramp shell it might still see play, but otherwise this probably would be enough to nerf this thing into the ground. Alright, moving on to the second on our list here, which is Field of the Dead. So, Field of the Dead is a land. It taps for colorless mana, and it enters the battlefield tapped. So, those are two pretty significant restrictions. Entering the battlefield tapped and tapping for colorless mana, that means it's going to be kind of rough on your mana base, probably. It's going to maybe put you behind a turn if you have to play it tapped. But as Field of the Dead has proven, and other cards like Urza's Saga, and these restrictions aren't that big, right? They're not that big of a deal. If the card is still really good, it's still going to be good. But what Field of the Dead goes on to say is, whenever it or another land enters the battlefield under your control, if you control 7 or more lands with different names, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. So this proved to just not actually be a restriction, right? This whole you need 7 lands with different names thing is nothing, right? It's so easy to do with different kinds of dual lands, with different kinds of basics, with snow lands, even if you want to. You know, it's just it's nothing, right? It just basically means once you get to 7 lands, you're going to start making zombies, and this basically made just all other fair decks unplayable. You just could not outvalue this thing that your opponent didn't put any investment in, right? The only cost they played was a colorless land that entered the battlefield tapped, and for that they get to beat your entire deck with value, right? Because all their land drops, it has that problem of making everything they draw off the top of their deck good. If they draw a ramp spell, it's going to make them a creature. If they draw a land even, it's going to make them a creature. If they draw a fetch land like Fable Passage, they get to make 4 power worth of bodies. It's just like, there's nothing bad they can draw from that point on. It's proven to be problematic even in non-standard formats, even in modern. It was just too strong, right? They had to ban it in modern, although, you know, debatably that's more of a Primeval Titan issue than a Field of the Dead issue. But I think I think it's proven that it's just too powerful of a card with entering the tapped and then tapping for colorless just not really being enough of a cost. So let's see how they fixed it. Let's see here. So scrolling down to Field of the Dead. So Field of the Dead Redo is a legendary land. So that by itself is maybe enough to fix this as an issue. I'll get a little bit more into it in a bit, but still has the other restrictions. Enters the battlefield tapped, taps for colorless mana, and whenever it has the same effect, except instead of just creating a 2/2 black zombie creature token, it makes a tapped 2/2 black zombie creature token. So first and foremost, it's now legendary. That means if you have Field of the Dead on the battlefield and you play another Field of the Dead, you have to sacrifice one of them. So you can imagine that if one copy of Field of the Dead was bad, once your opponent got like multiple copies of Field of the Dead on the battlefield, every land was making 2 zombies, every fetch land was making 4 zombies, it just became a multiplicative problem. So being limited to only have one Field of the Dead on the battlefield is a pretty good restriction, but more importantly, it means you really can't run 4 Field of the Deads. That's the real restriction that a legendary land has, because more so than just not being able to have multiple on the battlefield, it's imagine opening your opening hand and you've got 3 Field of the Deads in your hand. You just lose the game, right? You have to mulligan, but it's a hand you cannot keep because it effectively means that you have 2 dead cards in your hand. So it's a really big cost. It means you're probably going to only be able to run 1 or 2 copies of Field of the Dead, which means you're going to draw it less often, and it probably relegates it more to decks that can search it out. With cards like Golos, that's probably where this would show up. Would be a Golos style deck that searches it out, and it still probably, I think, would show up. It's just kind of a free roll, even in this fixed form. I think a lot of like control decks and mid-rangey decks and indie decks trying to slow things down a little bit, they probably would still just throw a Field of the Dead in there, because why not? If you have enough different duels, sometimes it's just going to win you the game by itself. But it's less of a dominating, gonna see it every game, gonna decide every game sort of threat that it was, while its real version was in standard. So I think that this is a pretty good fix, making it legendary, and the tap 2/2 black zombie creature tokens effectively just kind of puts it behind a turn. The problem with making them come into play untapped, the 2/2 black zombie creature tokens, is it kind of gave you more game against aggressive decks, where normally something like Field of the Dead would have problems, right? If you spend your first 3 or 4 turns just ramping, putting lands on the battlefield, and then put down a Field of the Dead, and you make a zombie, the fact that zombie is untapped a lot of times is the deciding factor to you being able to stabilize or not, right? Because your mono red opponent at the same time is trying to kill you, building up their board, and all of a sudden, just having that 2/2 blocker that you can throw in front of their biggest threat, and then you can turn around and Wrath or whatever, that's a lot of times going to be the deciding factor. So coming into play tapped is pretty big. It means that it basically puts the Field of the Dead deck back a turn, right? It makes it sort of in the same as like adding a mana to a Wrath effect, where it gives the aggressive decks a little more room to breathe. I think the same kind of thing is true here with Field of the Dead. By putting them tapped, you kind of give an extra turn of vulnerability for the aggressive decks to kind of attack Field of the Dead. So I think this is a good fix, and I think it's actually not a overwrought fix that would kind of make the card unplayable. I do think it would still be playable in this form. I do think that there would be, Golos decks that would go and get it, that would run like 2 copies. So if your opponent blew up the first one, you could go get the other one. And then I think there'd be a lot of decks that just ran 1 copy of it. A lot of controls or mid-range decks where it would just show up as 1 copy. So I think this is a good fix. I think this is pretty much ideal for how you want to fix these cards, where they're still playable, but not broken. All that said, I do think it's still probably just not a healthy card, even in this form, because it's just kind of, I don't know, it's just kind of free value, but it's a lot less egregious in this form, and I think it would still see play. So good fix all in all. So moving on to the next one, we've got Fires of Invention. So Fires of Invention, again, this is the original form. It's a 4-mana enchantment. It says you can cast spells only during your turn, and you can cast no more than 2 spells each turn, so a couple of restrictions you're putting on yourself. And in exchange, you may cast spells with mana value less than or equal to the number of lands you control without paying their mana costs. So that's the original version of the card, and let's go to the fixed version. So Fires of Invention here, their fixed version is 5 mana, so 3 red, and the exact same effect. So you play Fires of Invention, and you have 5 lands in the battlefield. You can cast a Cavalier of Flames, let's say, for free. And I think that this fix doesn't fix anything. I think it might actually be the case that bumping Fires of Invention up to 5 mana doesn't change anything, doesn't make it even a little bit less worse. I mean, there's a good argument against that in that it's specifically a second red mana. Now it's a little bit harder to cast. Here you have a little bit more restrictive. You're going to be a little bit more painful on your mana base to be able to hit that double red cost, but realistically, the problem with Fires of Invention is that it immediately paid for itself. That is why Fires of Invention was busted. Because you go, turn 4, play Fires of Invention, and then immediately cast a 4-drop, immediately cast a Questing Beast for free off of that, or immediately cast a Teferi, or immediately cast, in this case, when you play it on turn 5, you can just immediately cast a Cavalier. So I don't think this fixes the issue, because it's still basically a 0 mana card, right? That is the real problem with Fires of Invention, is there is no tempo loss. You sort of play it and you immediately are able to not even have really taken your turn off, right? So I don't think this is a good fix. I think I would be surprised if this significantly nerfed Fires of Invention. I almost think that the deck would just be just as strong as it was before with this. I don't think this is a real nerf, but we'll see. Maybe I'm wrong. So, okay, moving on to the next one. Nexus of Fate. Now this is a card I think that maybe Wizards regrets more than anything, to the point that they still seem terrified of extra turn decks. Like we saw that in the historic bans we saw recently, where there were some really messed up decks all based around Brainstorm, and instead of banning Brainstorm, they just banned the extra turn spell from one of the decks, because they just did not want a turns deck at the top of the format anymore. And I think this is why. I think this is just like PTSD, the card for them. But 7 mana instant. That's the problem. Instant. But we'll go on a little bit more. 7 mana instant, take an extra turn after this one. If Nexus of Fate would be put into the graveyard from anywhere, reveal Nexus of Fate and shuffle it into its owner's library instead. That's the other big problem, that it goes back into the library. So, basically what this meant is, you could play the control game, you could stall out your opponent, you could use Nexus of Fate as sort of a value. When you have your Teferi out, you can use Nexus of Fate to get another tick up on your Teferi. You can kind of take advantage of Nexus of Fate in a more fair way, kind of a typical way that control decks and mid-range decks might take advantage of extra turn spells, with the added benefit of it being an instant. But then eventually you would get down to 5-10 cards left in your deck, and 4 of those would be Nexus of Fate. And so a card like Azcanta is going to be able to find your Nexus of Fate every single turn. When you're drawing extra cards with Teferi, you're going to be always drawing that Nexus of Fate, and eventually you're going to get to the point where Nexus of Fate is the only card in your deck, really. Your opponent's just never going to be able to take another turn again. So all you have to do is have any kind of clock on the battlefield, whether that be Teferi, just exiling your opponent's permanents, or people would even play a spell that would make a 1/1 token, and a mass token, just to have a way to kill your opponent. Because once you have this loop going, once you're able to cast Nexus of Fate, shuffle it into your deck and cast it over and over and over again, your opponent's never going to get to play again. So all you need is a 1/1, and that's enough to win the game, because you're going to have infinite turns. So that was one problem with Nexus of Fate, and the other problem was Wilderness Reclamation, where the fact that this is an instant means that with Wilderness Reclamation out, you could tap all your mana. If you had 4 mana, let's say, with Wilderness Reclamation, you could tap your 4 lands, they get untapped on your end step, and then you could tap them again. So you basically have duplicated your mana from 4 to 8, specifically for instants, because that doesn't work with with non-instant spells. But with instants, you're able to kind of add all that mana together, and so that makes Nexus of Fate. That means you could cast Nexus of Fate for 4 mana instead of for 7. So those were the 2 main issues with Nexus of Fate. So let's see how they decided to fix one of their, I think, least favorite cards they've ever made. So Nexus of Fate, 7 mana, instant, so still in a 7 mana instant, take an extra turn spell, but then you exile it. So this basically stops the whole loop thing, right? You just have the one shot, take an extra turn. And I think this was actually kind of the intended design of Nexus of Fate. I think when they did the whole shuffle into the deck thing, I think in their minds they were like, this is just a kind of a cool way to exile it, right? In the same way that this exiles it and just says, okay, you had your fun, you don't get to loop this anymore. I think that's what they were trying to do with the original version of Nexus of Fate. We're trying to say, hey, this doesn't go into your graveyard because we're afraid you'll be able to recur it out of your graveyard over and over again. And instead they put it back into the deck where it was an even bigger recursion problem. So I think this is basically just the intended design of Nexus of Fate. So now it can't be your win condition. You can't just take infinite turns with Nexus of Fates, ticking up your Teferi, and it's probably not good enough to see play anymore. I don't think just to take an extra turn at 7 mana at instant speed is enough when it's not also your win condition. And it would still have the trick with Wilderness Reclamation. That would still probably see some play, but Wilderness Reclamation is another card that's going to be on this nerf list, so don't get your hopes up. But I think this is probably fine. I think it might see a little bit of play, but not gonna be like the top of the format, make everybody pull their hair out like it was before. So I do think just making it not shuffle back into your deck is enough of a fix. Probably see some play, but would not be the top of the format anymore, I don't think. Okay, moving on to the next one, we've got Oco, Thief of Crown. So the first Planeswalker on our list here. So it is a 3-mana Planeswalker that is banned in essentially every format except for Vintage and Commander. So you know this one was a problem. You know they really messed up with Oco. And in fact, Oco may be one of the most broken cards ever. It's definitely the most powerful Planeswalker ever printed, which is crazy to say because Planeswalkers are very powerful cards. So let's just get into it. A 3-mana, 4 loyalty Planeswalker. That's already a problem because it ticks up. It does a +2 to tick up to 6. So you've got a 3-mana Planeswalker that can immediately go up to 6 loyalty. So that's just really hard to beat through. That means your opponent's gonna have 6 power on board to be able to kill this thing. You know, one of the downfalls of 3-mana Planeswalkers is supposed to be if your opponent kind of already has an established board, they probably don't have much loyalty, so they are probably gonna die. But that's not really the case with Oco. But it +2s to make a food token, so that's whatever. That's not really worth much of anything. But its real problematic effect is +1, target artifact or creature loses all abilities and becomes a green elk creature with base power and toughness 3/3. And then it has an ultimate that doesn't matter. So don't worry about that ultimate. It's good, but it's not the problem. The problem is that +1. And so there's 2 reasons this is a problem. One, it makes it a pretty fast clock on its own. Just being able to go +2 make a food, +1 make that food into an elk, +2 make a food, +1 make that food into an elk. You know, that's sort of the baseline of Oco, and I think how they probably tested him out when they were playing with him. And all the while he's gaining loyalty while he does that. That's the issue. None of these abilities are minus abilities except for his ultimate, so he is just pumping out this army of elks and not actually losing any loyalty along the way. He's just getting more and more and more and becoming more and more of a problem to deal with as he's pumping out this army. But importantly, the +1 doesn't have to target your artifact or creature. It can target any artifact or creatures, and it becomes a 3/3 forever. So once you target your opponent's Embercleave and make it a 3/3, all of a sudden their Haymaker, I'm gonna win the game card now doesn't do anything. It's just a 3/3 that you can block with your 3/3s that you get to make while you're plussing up, right? So it kind of has this double. It's basically a removal spell. It's kind of a weird kind of Beast Within type removal spell that also wins you the game. And that's why Oco is so powerful, is it can deal with most threats, creatures, and artifacts, covers most of the threats in the game, and being able to turn those into non-ability 3/3s that are really benign, that are stopped by anything with 4 toughness, it makes Oco a real problem. So yeah, that's Oco just ended up being a card that didn't behave how they wanted it to. They said, Wizards went on to say that during playtesting they only really tried making their own stuff elks. They really didn't see the whole removal spell aspect of it, you know, and that ended up being the problem. So how did they go and decide to fix Oco Thief of Crown? So he is a 3-mana legendary planeswalker +1 to create a food token. So already a big fix. The fact that it comes into play and only pluses up to 5 loyalty instead of 6, and is not going to continue to +2, +2, +2 every turn. At most he can +1 per turn, and he has a -2 ability that says target artifact or creature loses all abilities and becomes a green elk. So same thing, but it's -2. So it's completely fixed now. This is a fine card. It might not even be a good card. I would be surprised if this was a good card, actually. It's kind of bad, but it is straight up 100% fixed like this. The problem with Oco is that it never had to give any loyalty to do what it was doing, right? If you think of the same play pattern we were just talking about, if it goes make a food token, turn that food into an elk, well, instead of being at 7 loyalty now while he just made a 3/3, which is ridiculous for a 3-mana planeswalker, instead now he's at 3 loyalty for having done the same thing. And if he does it again, if he pluses up to 4 and -2, now he's at 2 loyalty. So he can't just keep making 3/3s without burning himself out. Still not super quickly, still only going down by -1 every time he does this thing, but it does take 2 turns, and it is way more answerable than the baseline Oco, where it would just kind of fly off into Neverland of infinite loyalty while it was doing its thing. And if it goes after your opponent's stuff, if they go, okay, I'm going to minus your Embercleave and make it a 3/3, well, that's a pretty heavy cost now. Now that if they just play Oco and make him do that, now he's down to 2 loyalty, he's probably going to die. It's a lot harder to keep him alive. So I think it's completely fixed. I think this probably isn't even a good card anymore, but it has been completely, they really went nuclear on this. They probably realistically could have just made the elk thing a -2 and left the +2 as a for the creative food token, and it still probably would have been fixed, but they went scorched earth because I think Oco has just proven to be a completely insane card, so they really didn't want to miss the mark, I think. So yeah, completely fixed. So moving on to the next one, sort of the I don't know, there was sort of a parade of mistakes, kind of the Oco into Omnath, or Oco into Uro into Omnath, and so Omnath was kind of, to me, in that same family of messed up cards. Omnath, Locus of Creation, 4-mana card that costs 1 of every color except black. When it enters the battlefield, you get to draw a card. It's a 4/4, and then it has landfall, and when a land enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 4 life. If it's the first time it's resolved this turn, if it's the second time, you get to add all the mana back that you used to cast Omnath, and if it's the third time, you deal 4 damage to each opponent and each planeswalker you don't control. So Omnath has 2 problems. First and foremost, when he enters the battlefield, you draw a card. So there's just no downside to Omnath, right? If you play Omnath and he immediately dies, he does nothing. You don't have a land in hand to play. You don't have anything that you can do with the card. You just play him and you're like, well, that's all I can do. I pass the turn, and your opponent kills it. You still are ahead, right? Because your opponent used a removal spell to kill a card that already drew you a card. So they have gone -1 to themselves to make you go -0. So you're still ahead in card advantage. But really the real problem with Omnath is his landfall ability. So when a land enters the battlefield, you gain 4 life. This was actually a huge part of why Omnath was a problem, I think. Same idea with Uro, where having this incidental life gain just means these cards, these kind of dirtly cards that should have problems against aggressive decks, don't, because even if you don't get the other abilities off, you're going to be gaining 4 life pretty much every turn, and that's just too hard for an aggro deck to deal with. If it's the second time, you get to add the mana back. That's also a massive problem, because just like Fires of Invention, the fact that you're able to immediately kind of rebate all the costs of your spell. If you're able to go Omnath, play Omnath, you get to draw a card, play a fetch land, gain 4 life, crack that fetch land, put a land into play, gain 4 mana. You have cast Omnath for 0 mana. So they just that is a really problematic design that they had. They kind of kept making this mistake over and over again during this time period in Magic's history. And so that is the other big problem. And then the last one is dealing 4 damage, which isn't nearly as problematic. So the big problem is Omnath, it draws a card when it enters the battlefield, and it gets its mana back when you get your second land drop. So what are we doing to fix that? Let's see what they did. So Omnath Omnath, Locus of Creation, still a 4-mana card, still a 4/4. When it enters the battlefield, you scry 1 instead. So, okay, now there's an actual cost to the card. When it enters the battlefield, you still get the scry 1, which is something like, I don't know, drawing a third of a card, but it doesn't immediately replace yourself. You still lose resources if this card dies. And then it has the landfall ability. When a land enters the battlefield, gain 4 life. If it's the second time, you get to add the mana back. On the third time, okay, so it has all the same landfall abilities. I actually don't think this is enough of a fix. I think Omnath would still be very strong with this, because so this basically pushes Omnath back a turn in terms of being really good, right? And I think that was their very intentional design, was to say, okay, the same card, but you have to kind of play it on turn 5 instead of turn 4, because old Omnath, you play it on turn 4, you draw a card, and if it died, then, well, that sucks, but oh well. But this Omnath, you really are going to play it on turn 5. You're going to go, okay, I untap, I have 4 lands, I play my Omnath, I immediately play my fetched land and then crack it and get to do the whole thing. But I still think that's too good. I still think the fact that this is going to be a 0-mana card that invalidates aggro and is just an unbelievable monster to deal with. I don't know. I think the last few years Magic have proven that free cards are just always going to be a problem, even if you have to kind of jump through some hoops like you do with Omnath. I mean, and that hoop is really just have a kind of screwy mana base and also run fetch lands, right? So I don't think he'd be like the modern playable card he is now in this form, but I still think he would be very good in Standard and maybe even too good. So I don't know. This is a fix that I'm not sure quite does it. I think they kind of aimed a little risky with this one, I guess. The other, like Oco, they just kind of like atomic bombed it out of existence. But Omnath, they've taken a very light touch here, and I kind of don't think it would be enough. So my thoughts would be that Omnath is still very good. All right, moving on to the next one, Once Upon a Time. So Once Upon a Time, 2-mana instant, and if it's the first spell that you've cast this game, you may cast it without paying its mana cost. That's the entire problem. That's why the card's banned in both Standard and Modern. And when you cast it, you get to look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature or land from among them, put it into your hand, put the rest in the bottom of your library in any random order. So this is a consistency card, right? This is a card that you get to keep a hand that only has 1 land in a Once Upon a Time, because you know you're going to be able to use your Once Upon a Time to go find you a land. But also, if you have a hand that has too many lands, if you have 3 lands and you're like, oh man, I'm worried if I draw another land I might lose, well, Once Upon a Time kind of makes sure that you're going to be able to find some action in the form of a creature instead. Problem is that it's free, and like I said before, time and again we've proven that free cards are just too strong. Not having a mana cost, even if a card does nothing, even if it's Manamorphose, which does literally nothing, it's going to be broken somehow. The people are going to figure out a way to make it good. Now, obviously, it's banned in Standard and Modern because it's just too low of a cost, but that said, the card itself is not very good outside of the fact that it's free. If you actually look at what it does, 2 mana to kind of anticipate, basically. You get to go a little bit deeper than anticipate, but you can't just grab any card. It has to be a land or a creature, which, I mean, and the decks that run this is going to be most of the cards in the deck anyways, but it's basically an anticipate. Anticipate is not typically good enough to see play. It's just 2 mana to kind of not really do anything, to just kind of filter cards, is usually not enough. But the fact that this is free, again, it means that you can keep those hands. You don't have to get to 2 mana for this to fix your hand, right? You get to say, okay, I've only got 1 land, but even though I don't have enough mana to cast my Once Upon a Time, my Once Upon a Time is going to help me find that other land. And so, let's see how they fixed it. So, Once Upon a Time, 2 mana, instant. If this spell is the first spell you cast this game, you may pay 1 rather than play its mana cost, and then look at the top 5, creature or land, so the rest is the same. So, the change is that instead of being free, it costs 1 mana. And I think this probably makes the card unplayable. The difference between 1 mana and being free is pretty significant, because it means you're going to have to take your first turn off. It means you can't even do the really risky move of keeping like no lands but a Once Upon a Time. That's not a game plan anymore. Sometimes that was good enough if you had no lands but you had Llanowar Elves in hand or something like that. You had some way to kind of, if you can get one land, you can kind of make this all work. Sometimes you can make that happen with Once Upon a Time, but now you're going to have to basically take your first turn off. You can't just do the current Once Upon a Time trick to like wait until the very moment before you're about to cast your first spell, then cast this for free, and then cast your first spell, right? To kind of give yourself the maximum window of knowing what you need before you cast the card. You really have to just say, okay, turn 1, I haven't cast anything yet, I'm going to cast Once Upon a Time. And I think that's probably enough. It's hard to overstate how important being a free spell is to Once Upon a Time, because the effect itself is not extremely good. It's just the fact that it's free, right? That makes it such a free roll. So I think this probably, I don't know. I don't know if the card would be playable anywhere anymore. It might still be good enough in Standard, potentially. It definitely would not be good enough in Modern, I don't think. Definitely not good enough to be banned in either format, but I think it might still be playable in Standard, maybe if Standard was slow, but I think it might just not be playable anymore like this, which kind of goes to show you how important, how broken it is when something is free. To go from 0 mana to 1 mana, making it go from broken to maybe unplayable. So yeah, I would be surprised if this was good anymore. It might be barely playable. But moving on, we've got Teferi, Time Raveler. Probably the worst card ever printed. No, I don't like this card. I think a lot of people don't like this card because it kind of kills what makes Magic fun, which is interaction. But what it is, this is a 3-mana Planeswalker, like Oko, but a 3-mana Planeswalker that comes in with 4 loyalty, like Oko, but it has a static ability, which was new for Planeswalkers at the time, so it kind of makes sense they messed up with this one. But it has a static ability that says each opponent can cast spells only at a time they can cast sorceries, which means, you know, they can't cast instants, they can't cast stuff with flash outside of their own turn. So pretty bad. It basically means that you have to counter Teferi, is what it came down to. You have to hit him on his way down on the stack. Once he hits the battlefield, it's too late. You can't be holding up a removal spell, you can't be holding up a burn spell and be like, okay, they're going to resolve their Planeswalker, but I'll just kill it once they do. Because by the time Teferi hits the battlefield, your removal spell, your instant speed removal spell doesn't work anymore. So you have to say, okay, well, I pass back to my turn, and then I kill it, but by now you've kind of lost the tempo. You've had to use the mana on your own turn while your opponent kind of got to eat your mana the previous turn, so just made Planeswalker removal not really a thing. And then really the real problem is if you couldn't answer him right away, he kind of just turned off all the interaction in the game. He made your opponent guarantee that they were going to resolve all their spells, and we're not going to have any of their stuff messed with during their turn. So just that static ability is a problem. Then he can +1 until your next turn. You may cast sorcery spells as though they had flash. Sometimes mattered. I mean, it was good if he survived the first turn, if he didn't get beaten down or didn't get killed by something, and he kind of untapped with Teferi, it made it pretty difficult for like aggro decks or creature-based decks, because you could plus up and then you could cast your wraths at instant speed, so you could destroy all their creatures at instant speed. Once they were going for the attack, you could wrath, or if they didn't have enough to kill Teferi and they played a bunch of creatures to try to kill him next turn, you could say, okay, on your instead I wrath. So there's some situations where this +1 was pretty good, but really the problem was his -3 here, which was return target artifact, creature, or enchantment to its owner's hand and draw a card, and that's up to. So if your opponent didn't have anything to bounce, you could just minus it and draw a card. So kind of the Omnath problem, right, where you can play this for 3 mana, it has a really good static ability that just messes up a bunch of decks, makes removal for it really inconvenient, and you can just -3 immediately and draw a card if your opponent doesn't have any way to pressure it. So you can just sort of immediately cash it in. Then if your opponent is able to kill it, doesn't really matter, right? Because you've kind of replaced the card already. They're spending resources to kill something that you've already kind of made up for. So, and then of course if you actually do bounce something, it's even crazier, right? that's just in the situation where you don't bounce anything, it's really good. And when you do bounce one of your opponent's creatures or artifacts and steal 2 or 3 mana from them, then Teferi is just busted. So let's see how they decided to fix Teferi. So 4 mana Teferi Time Raveler comes into play with 5 loyalty, so they actually bumped his loyalty up. Each opponent can cast spells only time they cast sorcery, +1 till next turn you can cast sorcery spells. So it's the same thing. It's the same exact card, except they added a mana to it. This might be enough to make Teferi not very good. I'm kind of surprised they actually added a loyalty to it. I think 4 mana in its original card text would probably be not super great, but it would still be pretty good. I'm kind of surprised they thought it would be bad enough that it needed an extra point of loyalty so it could plus up to 6 immediately. So I don't know. I would expect this to still actually be a good card. 3 mana, it's definitely much worse being a 4 mana planeswalker instead of a 3 mana. It's a lot easier to kind of sneak in to Fairy, and especially it kind of made the play draw difference a really big deal. You know, being able to go like turn 1 Llanowar Elves, turn 2 to Fairy. And while your opponent has just had 1 turn, you know, your opponent has 1 turn to play their Llanowar Elves or maybe do nothing, just play a land, and you already have a Teferi the Time Raveler on the battlefield. That's obviously a big part of what made Teferi just busted. And part of what made Oko busted too was that there was 1 mana acceleration in the format. But so this is definitely a massive step back in terms of power by adding that additional mana. But I think maybe it was actually right to add that point of loyalty, because I think this is actually still a very playable card in its form. It's not busted, so probably a good fix. Maybe it's just my hatred for this card seeping through, because I would have hit it harder just so it would be, I guess, virtually unplayable. So I guess that wasn't the point of this whole experiment though, right? So probably actually a pretty good fix. I think this card would still be playable, but definitely not busted anymore. Okay, moving on, we've got Uro, Titan of Nature's Wrath. So like I was saying, to me there's this little family of cards that I don't really know why, but they all kind of fit together in my head, which is Oko, Uro, and Omnath, where they were kind of like Oko was the big mistake, then Uro was the big mistake, and then Omnath was a big mistake, in kind of similar ways, where they all had a kind of like incidental life gain. They all kind of, you know, made kind of dirtly decks that should have been weak against aggro, not weak against aggro in the way that they worked. But anyway, what this card does is it's a 3 mana legendary Elder Titan. When it enters the battlefield, it sacrifices itself unless it was escaped, so just comes into play and immediately dies. But when it enters the battlefield or attacks, you get to gain 3 life and draw a card, and then you may put a land from your hand onto the battlefield. And then it has an escape cost of 4 for green, blue, blue, exile 5 other cards out of your graveyard, and when you do that, it just comes back as a 6/6 permanently. It doesn't sacrifice itself. And then you still get the end of the battlefield. So Uro was just too damn strong. Like this card is just a disaster, kind of. Like, I don't really know what happened with testing this card, but gaining 3 life, drawing a card, and then putting the land on from your hand onto the battlefield untapped is really the problem, right? It means that this is basically a 2 mana card, right? You play this for 3 mana, you get to draw a card, gain 3 life, which really helps against aggro. Being able to repeatedly just kind of incidentally gain 3 life with Uro is a really big deal, and being able to put the land onto your battlefield basically makes this cost reduce itself. It kind of rebates back some of its cost by 1 mana. So again, this is the problem we have seen with a lot of these cards, is just kind of giving you back the mana that it costs to cast them. We saw it with Omnath, we saw it with Fires of Invention. It doesn't lead to good gameplay. It leads to these cards being kind of free rolls and being really dominant and suffocating for the format. So all in all, just a kind of a disaster of a card, and it just keeps coming back, which leads to very samey play patterns. That's more of a problem with Escape as a mechanic, though. Like, I think Escape is just maybe not a good mechanic, because it essentially allows you to play the same card a million times as long as you're able to fill up your graveyard. So I don't know. Anyway, the the card was a problem. It's banned in Standard and in Modern and in Historic, so it's just banned everywhere, really, besides the older formats. So let's check out and see what they did with Uro to fix it. So still 3 mana, still sacrifices itself when it enters the battlefield, unless it escaped. And when it enters the battlefield or attacks, you gain 3 life and you draw a card. I think this might be a controversial opinion, but I think this is completely fixed. I think this is all it took, right? Just not putting a land into play, not putting a land into play untapped specifically, because, look, the problem with Uro is, while you're dirtling, while you're gaining life and drawing cards, you're supposed to get punished for that, right? You're supposed to not be affecting the board, right? If you want to sit back and gain life and draw cards, you have to you have to set up an environment where that is okay to do, right? You have to have wraths and stuff and have ways to control the board where you're not just getting destroyed by aggro while you're doing it, right? So the problem with Uro is that it put a land into play, right? Not only did it rebate its cost by 1, but it meant that you're able to go like, okay, turn 1 Llanowar Elves, turn 2 Uro, turn 3 Nissa, or like, and it's you affected the board while you were doing your dirtling, right? While you were kind of messing around with a card that shouldn't really let you affect the board, that kind of should be useful in other ways in building resources and having a recurable threat. All the while it's letting you get to your 5 drops faster. So yeah, controversial opinion. I think some people will look at this card and say they didn't really fix it, but in my opinion, this completely fixes the card. The fact that it doesn't affect the battlefield, the fact that it's only gaining you 3 life and drawing you a card, the fact that it's just dirtling now, this is 100% a fix. I think this card's probably fine now. Okay, moving on to the next one, Veil of Summer. So the original version of Veil of Summer says, instant, 1 green mana, draw a card if an opponent casts a blue or black spell this turn. Spells you control can't be countered this turn. You and permanents you control gain hexproof from blue and from black until end of turn. So somebody on the development or design team lost 1 too many times to control and just got real mad about it because this card is insane. This is effectively a cryptic command, but for 1 green mana. You know, obviously it's only good against specific decks, it's only good against blue and black decks, but assuming you're up against a blue or black deck, you either sideboard this in, or if the format is homogenous enough where most decks are playing blue or black, you can even have it in the main deck, which I think a lot of people did, and just sided it out in the odd matchup where it wasn't that good. But it's just too good. It stops all forms of interaction. Spells can't be countered. Your stuff can't be targeted. You can't be targeted, so discard doesn't work. Like, it just stops everything, every form of interaction that blue and black has effectively. And then the most important part is you get to draw a card. So even if your opponent doesn't target your stuff, like this, you know, if it was just a defensive card entirely, and just, you know, if it didn't have the draw a card clause on it, and it was just like, you get hexproof from blue and black, permanents you have get hexproof from blue and black, spells you control can't be countered this turn, it would still be kind of a pretty good interactive card. But the fact that it draws a card means even if your opponent doesn't target you, even if they say, I think they got a Veil of Summer up, I'm not going to Thoughtseize them, I'm not going to try to counter their stuff or whatever, I'm just going to play my Planeswalker, right? I'm just going to play my Ashiok or whatever. You can just go, okay, Veil of Summer, cycle it. You can just draw a card anyway, right? 'Cause even if your opponent isn't messing with you, you can always just kind of cycle this away, assuming that they have blue or black in their deck. You can pretty much just cycle this away whenever you want to. So it doesn't even have like an opportunity cost of your opponent just saying, alright, I'm just not going to target you, I'm not going to counter your stuff, you know, then your Veil of Summer doesn't do anything. It still does something. It can still cycle itself away. So you don't really get stuck with like multiple of them in your hand ever. So let's see how they fixed Veil of Summer. So Veil of Summer, same effect. Draw a card if your opponent has cast a blue or a black spell this turn. Can't be countered, and permanents you control get hexproof, but it's 2 mana. Instead of 1 mana, it's 2 mana. And this is probably still really playable, but also fine. The problem before was that it was a counter card to the blue and black to the point of being oppressive. It was a ridiculously strong counter to those colors, to the point that you would almost just, like I said, people would main deck it just to kind of auto win against any deck playing blue or black, and then if they're up against mono red, they just sideboard it out in games 2 and 3. But like, this isn't that strong. This is something that you have in your sideboard specifically against blue and black decks, and then you bring it in against those decks, and it'll be pretty good against them there. And still not even crazy good like Veil of Summer was. Just leaving 1 green mana up is super easy. Leaving 2 mana up is gonna really, you know, slow you down a bit. So I think this is actually a completely fine fix. It puts Veil of Summer back in sort of the same realm as the other color hoser card that it came out with around the same time. It's kind of comical to look at Veil of Summer compared to, like, you know, the other hate cards they printed alongside it, because it's really not even comparable for the most part. But yeah, okay, I think this is a good fix. It turns it into a pretty good sideboard card instead of just a nightmare. So all right, so good fix with Veil of Summer. Moving on, we got Wilderness Reclamation. We got 2 more left. Wilderness Reclamation. is a 4-mana enchantment in its original form that says, at the beginning of your end step, untap all lands you control. So we kind of already talked about how this is problematic with Nexus of Fate, right? Nexus of Fate, which is a 7-mana instant, so you play Wilderness Reclamation, it immediately untaps 4 lands, so you can cast like a card draw spell for 4 mana. I think Chemister's Insight was the pretty normal card draw spell casted around that time. So you would play this, it would effectively be a 0-mana spell. Again, problem that just kept happening during this era in Magic design. I don't know who was the person who thought this was a great idea, but somebody thought it was a fantastic design to just let you cast cards for basically 0 mana. So that's problem number 1, Wilderness Reclamation. You play it, it immediately untaps 4 lands, and then you're able to cast a 4-mana removal spell at instant speed, or a 4-mana draw card effect, or, you know, it doesn't actually have a mana cost, is the problem. And then the real issue, not only is it free and lets you basically cast it without actually spending any mana, but once it actually gets back to your turn, then you get to double up your mana, right? I think maybe the intended design of Wilderness Reclamation was something like, okay, I cast my 4-drop creature, then I go to my end step and untap my lands, and then during your turn I can hold up a counter spell. You know, maybe it was some sort of like flash enabler or something, letting you play stuff on your turn and stuff on your opponent's turn. But what actually happened was, you know, they would go to my end step, float 4 mana, untap my lands, float the other 4 mana, cast a 7-mana instant like Nexus of Fate, or they had a lot of mana. They had like 6 or 7 lands on the battlefield. They could tap it for like 14 mana, and then use all that in a giant expansion explosion to just burn your opponent out of the game. So it basically was mana duplication and also free. So it kind of has the Fires of Invention problem, right? I think they're actually very similar cards in terms of why they're problematic. Both of them immediately kind of rebate their cost. Fires of Invention, as a reminder, comes down and lets you cast stuff for free that's equal to or less than the number of lands you have. Wilderness Reclamation is the same in a lot of ways. It comes down, immediately untaps your lands. It basically allows you to have this really good mana doubling effect without actually having to invest anything, without having to take a turn off to set this up. So how did they end up fixing that? Okay, so Wilderness Reclamation, 4-mana enchantment. At the beginning of your end step, untap 2 target lands you control. Okay, this isn't even playable anymore. This one got the Oco treatment, I think, where they just wanted to destroy it. They wanted this card to suffer, and they really just nerfed it into absolute oblivion. This is not a playable card anymore. So, yeah, not much to say. The difference between untapping 6 lands and untapping 2 lands, the difference from playing a 4-mana card and immediately untapping 4 mana, so you're able to do whatever you want, you know, having basically paid no cost, is completely different from paying a 4-mana card and untapping two lands. So I think this probably means that my thoughts were correct, that they probably thought of this as like, you do stuff on your turn and then you untap 2 lands to have a counter spell up. It's, you know, a little dinky like negate up or something. But now it's just not worth the card. So yeah, I think this completely fixes the card, and more than that, it just makes the card unplayable. Yeah. So all right, on to our last one, Winota, Joiner of Forces. So Winota was one of the main problematic cards with Agent of Treachery. You know, if you remember this guy, the 7-mana that comes into play and steals something, this is one of the main ways that was able to cheat him out pretty effectively, and it led to Winota being banned in Historic. So what Winota does is, whenever a non-human creature you control attacks, look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may put a human creature card from among them onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking. It gains indestructible until the end of turn. Put the rest on the bottom in a random order. So the idea being, you could attack with a little 1/1 goblin token and look at the top 6 cards of your deck and spit out a Agent of Treachery, right, directly onto the battlefield for 0 mana. So obviously a problem, and you know, a big issue is that Winota does it as soon as she comes down, right? Winota herself doesn't have to attack. You can already have the token on the battlefield. More realistically, with Winota decks, you had like 2 or 3 attackers on the battlefield, so you play Winota, attack with those 3 attackers, and you look at the top 18 cards of your deck and throw 3 humans into play. So just a disaster. It's just basically too many cards, right? You just would never miss, and moreover, more than just not missing, you would have a really good selection of cards. You would get to dig through just like half your freaking deck looking for stuff. So let's see how they fixed Winota. So Winota, 4 mana, still a 4/4. Whenever a non-human creature you control attacks, look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may put a human creature card from among them onto the battlefield, tap attacking, gains indestructible, and then put the rest on the bottom. So all the same, just 4 instead of 6. So this is kind of interesting. It's kind of hard to evaluate in terms of a fix. I think it is definitely 6 is 4 is more in the realm of if you build your deck the right way, you're probably going to hit 1 most of the times. And I think 6 was more in the realm of you were just never going to miss, right? You were just never going to have an attack with Winota that whiffs unless you have just like already dug all the humans out of your deck and cheated them onto the battlefield. Then you start whiffing, but up until that point, you're just pretty much never going to miss with Winota. And again, it's not only are you not going to miss with the Winota, you're going to have your choice most of the time. You're going to hit like 2 or 3 different humans and get to choose one from among them. So it's not even like you kind of have your pick of which human you want to put onto the battlefield. So this one's a little hard to evaluate. I do think it's probably enough to make the card unbannable and historic, but Winota still does have the problem of just being able to turn, to spit out stuff like On-Grass Marauders, stuff like Agent of Treachery, just to spit them out for 0 mana. And I don't know if just limiting it to 4 cards is quite enough to make that not a problem anymore. It does mean that you're less likely. You're probably gonna have to run like 4 copies of On-Grass Marauders and 4 copies of Agent of Treachery, the max amount, to kind of try to guarantee that you hit one of them when you attack with your creatures. And that's a lot less good than being able to not run many and still be pretty much guaranteed that you're going to hit them. So I don't know, it's kind of interesting. I do think this is more of a kind of like Omnath, kind of a light touch to see what if we just made it markedly worse, but not unplayable, not like Wilderness Reclamation. Don't give it the nerf it to the ground treatment, but give it the maybe it's still too good, maybe it's not kind of treatment. So I wouldn't be surprised if Winota was still a very powerful deck in Historic with this fix, but it would definitely be a lot less consistent, would definitely make the deck building restriction a lot more real. So anyway, that is going to wrap it up. That's all the cards that I know of that they're going to be fixing in their little event here. Ultimately, I think if it's just for fun, it's just for fun. I don't really believe that. I don't think Wizards would kind of pass up this opportunity, because I think I think erratas is something that's incredibly attractive to them, not only from a game design perspective to be able to make a better game, but just from a monetary perspective, because currently their solutions for fixing broken cards all suck, right? They either just have to let the card fester and mess up their formats, which means less people are playing, which means less money, or they have to ban the card, which means people quit the game. So they just don't really have good solutions at the moment to what happens when, because development's never going to be perfect. Stuff is always going to slip through. I do think a lot more stuff has slipped through recently than probably it should have, but it's always going to happen, right? Nobody's perfect. And it's sort of a errata. There's a reason why every game in the world patches itself now. There's a reason why card games always use erratas. It's because it's a really convenient tool, and I would be really, really surprised if Wizards isn't eyeballing the possibilities, seeing how this whole event's going to go, seeing how people think about it, thinking, maybe there's okay to have separations of digital cards versus the physical. Maybe that's how they do it. They just errata them online, but on paper they're the same. We'll see. But anyway, it'll be interesting to see where things go. I had fun kind of evaluating the new designs. I think some of them are really big nerfs, some of them not so much. So it'll be interesting to see how things turn out. But this has been 2D. I hope you enjoyed watching, and I'll see you next time.